You never know who's watching. The air in Brooksville, North Carolina, was thick with humidity that Tuesday morning. The sun was barely up, but the heat was already pressing against the city streets, mirroring the tension inside Brooksville Police Department, a precinct with a dark reputation. Officers whispered in corners, exchanged knowing smirks, and laughed at off-color jokes, nothing unusual. This was their world. A tall black man stepped out of an old, dusty Ford pickup, his hands slipping into the pockets of his worn jeans. He adjusted his baseball cap low over his face and took in the scene. No one looked twice at him. Perfect. That's exactly what David Carter wanted. He wasn't here to be seen. He was here to see. Brooksville PD had a history of corruption, and David had heard enough horror stories to know what he was walking into. As the newly appointed chief of police, he was taking on a force that had been left to fester, where unchecked power, racism, and abuse ran rampant. But David wasn't a man who believed in second-hand accounts. He wanted to witness it firsthand. And that's why, instead of announcing his arrival with flashing lights and a formal introduction, he walked through the doors of his own precinct disguised as an outsider. Police Light, if you think this story needs to be heard, hit that like button and share it. Help spread the message. And don't forget to subscribe to RVM, Black Struggles for more powerful stories. Police Light. The station buzzed with early morning energy, phones ringing, papers shuffling, officers cracking jokes over stale coffee. A few uniformed men leaned against their desks, chatting. No one even glanced his way. That is, until he stepped too close to the break room. A sharp, commanding voice sliced through the air. Right pointing finger. "Hey! You lost, buddy?" David turned toward the voice. A white officer stood with his arms crossed, a smug grin on his face. His badge read, Officer Ryan Daniels. The name rang a bell. Daniels sized him up, taking in David's plain flannel shirt and scuffed sneakers. He didn't see a man. He saw a nobody. Right pointing finger. "This ain't a shelter," Daniels sneered. "You need to take that mess somewhere else." Laughter erupted behind him as a few officers turned to watch. David said nothing. Right pointing finger. "You hear me?" Daniels took a step forward, voice rising. "We don't need people like you hanging around here. Get out." David's fingers curled into a fist inside his pocket, but he forced himself to stay calm. Not yet. He needed to see how far this would go. Fire. What would you do in this situation? If you think David is handling this right, drop a 1 in the comments. If not, drop a 0. And if you have no opinion, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. Fire. Right pointing finger. This is just the beginning. Keep watching to see what happens next. Megaphone. Don't forget to turn on notifications for RVM, Black Struggles so you never miss a powerful story like this. Megaphone. Then, Daniels did the unthinkable. Without warning, he spit straight into David's face. A thick silence dropped over the room, then, laughter. Some officers doubled over, slapping their knees in amusement. Others shook their heads like this was routine. David could feel the warm saliva trickling down his cheek, but what burned more was the utter disregard in their eyes. This was not just a department problem. This was a culture. David slowly reached into his pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and wiped his face. His hands didn't shake. His expression didn't change. Right pointing finger. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through those doors?" he asked, voice eerily calm. Daniels grinned, stepping back like he'd just won a game. Right pointing finger. "Only the ones who don't belong here." More laughter. David held Daniels' gaze, letting the weight of that sentence settle between them. But instead of fighting back, instead of demanding respect, he did something unexpected. Right pointing finger. He turned and walked away. No one knew that in just a few minutes, their world was about to turn upside down. You just spat in the wrong man's face. The Brooksville Police Department's briefing room was buzzing with energy. Officers strolled in casually, carrying coffee mugs, cracking jokes, and discussing their weekend plans. The air was filled with the scent of cheap, overbrewed coffee and the faint mustiness of old case files. To them, it was just another morning. Ryan Daniels leaned against the back wall, still grinning from his earlier encounter. He reveled in the reaction he'd gotten from his fellow officers. Putting a nobody in his place, it was practically a morning ritual. What made today any different? At the front of the room, Captain Thomas Harris, a gruff veteran with a graying mustache, stepped up to the podium and cleared his throat. Right pointing finger. "All right, settle down," Harris called, his voice cutting through the chatter. "We've got an important introduction today." The murmuring died down slightly. Daniels barely paid attention, uninterested in whatever bureaucratic nonsense was about to be thrown at them. He had no idea the ground beneath him was about to crumble. Right pointing finger, as most of you know, Harris continued, Chief Caldwell retired last month. Today, I have the honor of introducing our new Chief of Police, a man with an outstanding record, decades of experience, and a vision for this department's future. A few officers leaned forward, curious. Some whispered to each other. Daniels didn't flinch. He was too busy scrolling through his phone. Then, the footsteps. Measured. Slow. Purposeful. From a side door, a figure stepped into the room. A figure that Daniels knew. Daniels froze. His blood turned ice cold. The murmurs grew. Heads turned. Eyes widened. A ripple of shock swept through the room. Because walking up to the podium, standing in front of every single officer in that room, was the same black man Daniels had spat on just minutes ago. But now, he wasn't wearing a worn-out flannel shirt. He wasn't wearing scuffed sneakers. Right pointing finger, he was wearing the badge. Right pointing finger, he was wearing the title. Right pointing finger, he was their new boss. Captain Harris gestured toward him. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Chief David Carter. Silence. A deafening, suffocating silence. Daniel's mouth fell open, but no words came out. He felt the entire room shift, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. His pulse hammered in his ears. David Carter stepped up to the lectern, his presence commanding, his eyes scanning the room with an unreadable expression. His gaze landed on Daniels. And held. Longer than necessary. Daniels turned red. Then white. Then red again. David let the silence linger, letting the weight of the moment settle over them all. Then, with a steady, controlled voice, he finally spoke. Right pointing finger, good morning. Not a single officer breathed. Right pointing finger, my name is David Carter. As of today, I am your new Chief of Police. Daniels felt sick. He wanted to disappear. David let the tension build before continuing, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. Right pointing finger, when I arrived this morning, I didn't come in uniform. I didn't come with an entourage or a speech. I wanted to see this department for what it really is, not the version presented in scheduled meetings, but the one that exists when no one is watching. He let his words sink in. Every single officer was now on edge. Right pointing finger, and what I saw, David continued, was eye-opening. Someone shifted uncomfortably. A few exchanged uneasy glances. Right pointing finger, in just a few minutes inside these walls, I saw behavior that wasn't just unprofessional, it was disgraceful. Disrespectful. David let his eyes move across the room, landing on every guilty party. No one dared to move. Right pointing finger, and let me make something very clear. His voice dropped, low, firm, and unwavering. Right pointing finger, that ends today. Daniels swallowed hard. David took one step forward, gripping the edges of the podium. Right pointing finger, respect, he said, is not optional. It's the foundation of what we do as law enforcement. Without it, we fail, not just each other, but the community we swore to protect. The room remained dead silent. David turned, looking directly at Daniels now. The man who had humiliated him just minutes earlier. Daniels' face was a shade of deep crimson. His eyes darted to the floor. He couldn't hold David's gaze. Right pointing finger, this morning, David continued, some of you laughed at what you thought was just another powerless man being put in his place. He let the words hang in the air. Daniel's stomach twisted. Right pointing finger, but let me remind you, everyone who walks through those doors deserves respect. Whether they wear a badge or not. The silence in the room was suffocating. Some officers sat stiffly, their faces tight with realization. Others glanced sideways at Daniels, who looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. David let out a slow breath. He knew this was just the beginning. Right pointing finger, effective immediately, he declared, Officer Ryan Daniels is suspended, pending an internal investigation. Gasps. Whispers rippled through the room. Some officers' eyes went wide. Others looked away. Daniels stiffened, his entire body locking up. Right pointing finger, Chief, he stammered. Right pointing finger, save it, David cut him off. His voice didn't waver. His authority was undeniable. You didn't care to listen this morning. You don't get to speak now. Daniels clenched his jaw, his fists trembling. David turned back to the room, his voice steady, powerful. Right pointing finger, and for those of you who think this is just a slap on the wrist, think again. His eyes swept the stunned officers. Right pointing finger, This is the first of many changes. The briefing room was no longer a room full of cocky, untouchable officers. It was a room full of men and women who had just realized something terrifying. Their world had just changed. And David Carter wasn't here to make friends. He was here to clean house. And nothing was going to stop him. Corruption hides in plain sight, but not for long. The moment David Carter stepped down from the podium, the atmosphere inside the Brooksville Police Department shifted. The power dynamics that had ruled this place for years had just been flipped upside down. Daniels stood frozen in place. His face burned with humiliation, his jaw clenched so tightly that veins pulsed in his neck. He had always been untouchable. Always been the one calling the shots. But now he was the target. Some officers exchanged nervous glances, while others sat perfectly still, unwilling to make eye contact with their new boss. A few of them looked almost impressed. Maybe, just maybe, change was finally coming. Right pointing finger, Captain Harris, David said, addressing the room once more, I want Daniels' full record on my desk within the hour. Every complaint, every incident report, no matter how small they seemed at the time. Harris, a seasoned officer who had learned to play politics, hesitated. His eyes flickered toward Daniels, then back to David. This wasn't how things were done here. David saw the pause. He held Harris's gaze, his expression unwavering. Right pointing finger, is there a problem, Captain? His voice was calm, but the underlying authority was impossible to ignore. A long beat. Then Harris swallowed and shook his head. Right pointing finger, no, Chief. I'll have it for you. David nodded. Good. Then he turned back to the room, letting his eyes settle on the officers who had been laughing just minutes ago. Right pointing finger, let me be clear. This department is not a private club. It is not a kingdom ruled by a few. The days of backroom deals and unchecked power are over. A heavy silence filled the room. Some officers looked down at their hands. Others sat rigidly, their pride wounded. David let his words sink in. Right pointing finger, if you are here to serve this community, I will stand beside you. But if you are here to serve yourself, protect criminals, and abuse your badge? He took a step closer, scanning the crowd. Right pointing finger, you will not last under my command. The room remained dead silent. Then, without another word, David turned on his heel and strode out, leaving a room full of stunned officers in his wake. Inside the chief's office, the investigation begins. David closed the door to his office, took a deep breath, and let the weight of the moment settle in. He had just declared war, and he knew it. He sat at his desk and leaned back, his fingers pressing against his temple. Brooksville PD wasn't just corrupt, it was rotten to its core. And Daniels? Daniels wasn't just a bad officer. Right pointing finger, Daniels was the symptom of a much larger disease. Minutes later, Captain Harris arrived with a thick file, dropping it on the desk with a soft thud. David opened it and started reading. And what he saw made his blood run cold. The truth about Ryan Daniels, a criminal with a badge. The complaints against Daniels were staggering. Red circle, use of excessive force against civilians, never disciplined. Red circle, fabricating evidence, swept under the rug. Red circle, mysterious disappearances of key witnesses, cases dropped. Red circle, ties to known criminals, overlooked. The deeper David read, the more the pit in his stomach grew. Daniels wasn't just a racist cop with a bad attitude. He was a predator. And the worst part? Right pointing finger, Brooksville PD had been protecting him for years. David snapped the folder shut, his jaw tightening. His instincts had been right. He hadn't just walked into a department with a culture problem. He had walked into a battlefield. A knock at the door. He looked up as Officer Emma Reyes hesitated at the entrance, her posture rigid with nervousness. Right pointing finger, Chief. I need to talk to you. David gestured for her to come in. She stepped forward, closing the door behind her. She looked over her shoulder once, as if making sure no one saw her here. Right pointing finger, I don't know who I can trust, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. David folded his arms. What do you know, Officer Reyes? She swallowed, then met his eyes. Right pointing finger, I think they're going to try and take you down. David's spine stiffened. Right pointing finger, who? She hesitated. Then, the words came out like a confession. Right pointing finger, not just Daniels. There's a group of them. They've been covering for each other for years. And Chief, they don't play fair. David's jaw tightened. He had suspected it. But now he had confirmation. Right pointing finger, he wasn't just dealing with one corrupt officer. Right pointing finger, he was dealing with a whole network of them. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Brooksville PD, Daniels stormed into the locker room, his body still buzzing with rage. His reputation, his control, his dominance, all shattered in front of everyone. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before a voice answered. Right pointing finger, we have a problem, Daniels growled. A pause. Then, a slow, amused chuckle on the other end of the line. Right pointing finger, don't worry, Daniels. The voice was smooth, calculated. We'll handle it. Daniels' grip tightened around the phone. He wasn't going down without a fight. And neither were the men who had been protecting him all these years. Back in David's office, David leaned back in his chair, processing Reyes' warning. This wasn't just about cleaning up the department anymore. This was war. And war meant someone was going to fight back. But David wasn't afraid. He glanced down at Daniels' file again, then back up at Reyes. Right pointing finger, tell me everything you know. Because if these officers thought they could scare him away, they were dead wrong. When justice stands alone, who will fight beside it? Brooksville wasn't just a town with a police problem. The police were the problem. And now, David Carter was walking straight into their den, alone. Inside the lion's den, the thin blue wall closes in. The day after Daniels' suspension, something shifted inside the department. The air was different. David could feel it the second he walked through the front doors of Brooksville PD. The usual morning chatter was gone. The casual laughter? Gone. Instead, officers stared. Some exchanged knowing glances. Others folded their arms and looked away. A few muttered under their breath. Daniels wasn't just a bad cop. He had been a leader. And his people weren't happy that he had been taken down. David reached his office, closed the door behind him, and sat down. It was already happening. The thin blue line, that unspoken brotherhood that protected its own, no matter the crime, was closing ranks. He wasn't just an outsider. He was a target. The first strike, a message of warning. That night, David Carter's car was vandalized. Red spray paint slashed across the windshield. Get out. The tires? Slashed. The side mirrors? Smashed. David stood in the dim glow of the street lamp, staring at the destruction. His heartbeat remained steady. He had seen worse. He had lived through worse. This was amateur work. But it was a message. Right pointing finger, they weren't going to play fair. Inside Brooksville PD, the conspiracy deepens. As David began investigating Daniels' past cases, patterns emerged. Red circle, case files were missing. Red circle, evidence had been tampered with. Red circle, witnesses had mysteriously disappeared. David called in Officer Emma Reyes. She walked in, her eyes darting around the office like she expected someone to be listening. Right pointing finger, Chief, something isn't right. David leaned forward. Tell me what you know. Reyes swallowed. Right pointing finger, it's not just Daniels. There's a group of them. High-ranking officers. They cover for each other. David's fingers tightened around his pen. Right pointing finger, who? She hesitated. Right pointing finger, I don't know all their names, but... She exhaled, voice shaky, I know they call themselves the Brotherhood. David's gut twisted. A secret fraternity of corrupt cops, protecting each other, covering for each other, controlling Brooksville PD from the inside out. And now? Right pointing finger, they were coming for him. The second strike, corruption fights back. The next morning, David arrived at the station to find his office door wide open. Inside? A disaster. Red circle, his desk was overturned. Red circle, his papers were scattered. Red circle, his computer was smashed. But it was what was left on his desk that made his blood turn cold. A single bullet. A note next to it, written in bold black ink. Right pointing finger, this is your only warning. David picked up the bullet, rolling it between his fingers. A warning? No. A challenge. He smiled. Right pointing finger, looks like we're playing for keeps. A dangerous move, calling in backup. David wasn't naive. Fighting this war alone was suicide. So that night, he made a phone call. To the FBI. Right pointing finger, I need your help. Meanwhile, in the shadows. Deep inside a dimly lit bar, Ryan Daniels sat with a group of officers. He was no longer in uniform. His badge had been taken, his gun confiscated. But he still had power. Right pointing finger, Carter thinks he can take us down, he muttered, gripping his beer bottle tightly. He doesn't understand how things work around here. A bald, heavy-set officer next to him leaned forward. Right pointing finger, what do you want us to do? Daniels smirked. Right pointing finger, we remind him that he's not welcome here. A pause. Then, a round of nods. The Brotherhood wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The storm is coming. David Carter had made his move. And now, Brooksville PD was about to explode. Would he survive the war? Or would corruption bury him before he could take them down? Justice is only as strong as the man willing to stand alone. Brooksville was a town that had learned to look the other way. For years, the corruption within its police force had been an open secret. People whispered about it, feared it, but no one dared to challenge it. Until now. David Carter had drawn a line in the sand. And now, they were coming for him. The midnight ambush, a life on the line. The night was quiet, too quiet. David had spent the entire day reviewing files, uncovering damning evidence that tied Daniels and his network to illegal dealings with drug traffickers and cover-ups of police brutality cases. He was getting too close. At 11:47 p.m., as he pulled his car into his driveway, a shadow moved behind him. Before he could react, bam! A masked figure slammed his driver's side window with a crowbar. David's instincts kicked in. Collision, bang! A second attacker fired a shot at his car. Glass shattered. David rolled out of the vehicle just in time, hitting the pavement hard. His mind raced. 2 attackers. Maybe more. He reached for his gun, but they were faster. A heavy boot slammed into his ribs, knocking the air from his lungs. Then, a low voice hissed. Right pointing finger, you don't belong here, Carter. Another brutal kick to the stomach. David groaned, pain exploding through his body. A third voice chuckled. Right pointing finger, maybe this'll teach you to mind your own business. A cold metal barrel pressed against the back of his head. David froze. Was this it? Was this how it ended? His mind spun. He had faced death before. But never like this. Never at the hands of the people sworn to protect. Then, a sudden light flooded the street. A car screeched to a halt. Police light, red and blue lights flashed. Right pointing finger, drop your weapons. A commanding voice rang out. The attackers scattered into the darkness. David rolled onto his back, chest heaving. The sound of footsteps pounded toward him. A face hovered above him. Officer Emma Reyes. Right pointing finger, Chief. Are you okay? David coughed, gripping his ribs. Did you get them? Reyes shook her head. They disappeared into the alley. No plates on their vehicle. No IDs. David exhaled sharply. They weren't just trying to intimidate him anymore. They were trying to kill him. The fallout. No one is safe anymore. By morning, the attack on Chief Carter had spread through the department like wildfire. Some officers acted shocked, pretending they didn't know who was behind it. Others stayed silent. And then, there were those who weren't surprised at all. David walked into the precinct battered and bruised, but standing tall. Right pointing finger, listen up. His voice was firm, unwavering. Right pointing finger, last night, cowards tried to silence me. Tried to make me afraid. His eyes scanned the room, landing on the ones he suspected the most. Right pointing finger, it didn't work. A ripple of unease passed through the officers. Right pointing finger, you think you can break me? You think you can scare me off? He took a slow step forward. You have no idea who you're dealing with. The tension was suffocating. Then, a voice spoke from the back of the room. Right pointing finger, maybe you should take the hint, Chief. David turned slowly. Captain Greg Lawson. The second in command. A man who had stayed neutral in all of this. Until now. David locked eyes with him. Right pointing finger, you saying something, Captain? Lawson smirked, folding his arms. Just saying. Maybe the town doesn't want change. Maybe the department doesn't either. David held his gaze. Right pointing finger, maybe you're afraid of what happens when people start looking too closely at you, Captain. A flicker of something, fear? Anger? Flashed across Lawson's face. Then, without another word, he walked away. The FBI steps in. The game changes. David had had enough. That evening, he met with 2 federal agents in a dark SUV parked a block away from the station. He handed over a folder. The evidence. The names. The crimes. Right pointing finger, I need these bastards off my streets. One of the agents, a tall woman with sharp eyes, flipped through the documents. Right pointing finger, you know this means war, Chief Carter. David nodded. Right pointing finger, it already is. The agent sighed, then shut the folder. Right pointing finger, we'll be in touch. As David stepped back onto the sidewalk, he glanced over his shoulder. He had just fired the first real shot. Now, all hell was about to break loose. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Brooksville, inside a dimly lit warehouse, Ryan Daniels stood in front of a group of officers. Some in uniform. Some off duty. All of them loyal. Daniels' face was twisted with rage and humiliation. Right pointing finger, Carter thinks he's untouchable. A few men muttered in agreement. Daniels slammed his fist against a table. Right pointing finger, we built this damn town. We built this department. And I'm not gonna let some outsider burn it to the ground. One of the officers leaned forward. Right pointing finger, what's the plan? Daniels' eyes gleamed with something dark. Something dangerous. Right pointing finger, we hit him where it hurts. He smirked. Right pointing finger, his family. The stakes just got higher. David Carter had declared war on corruption. But he wasn't the only one willing to fight dirty. Would he survive what came next? Or would his enemies take him down, once and for all? You can fight corruption, but what happens when corruption fights back? David Carter had expected resistance. He had expected pushback, intimidation, and threats. But what came next? He never saw it coming. A terrifying warning, they're coming for his family. The night was dark, the streets of Brooksville eerily quiet as David pulled into his driveway. He had barely stepped out of his car when his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. Right pointing finger, hello? Silence. Then, hello, distorted voice whispered. Right pointing finger, you should have left when you had the chance, Carter. David's entire body went rigid. Right pointing finger, who is this? The voice chuckled. Then, the sound of a little girl crying. David's heart stopped. Right pointing finger, Daddy? The small, terrified voice on the other end was his daughter. His blood turned to ice. Right pointing finger, where is she? If you touch her. The voice interrupted, still disturbingly calm. Right pointing finger, relax, Chief. She's safe. For now. David's hand tightened around his phone. Right pointing finger, if you hurt her, I swear to God. Another chuckle. Right pointing finger, you're the one hurting her, Carter. Because you don't know when to stop. Then, a click. The call went dead. David stood in the middle of his driveway, chest heaving, hands shaking. They had just crossed the line. A desperate race, finding his daughter. David burst through the front door, his heart slamming against his ribs. Right pointing finger, Emily. His wife, startled, rushed into the hallway. Right pointing finger, David, what's wrong? Right pointing finger, where's Maya? Where's our daughter? Emily's eyes widened in panic. She's upstairs, sleeping. But David was already taking the stairs two at a time. He threw open Maya's bedroom door. And there she was. Safe. Sleeping soundly, curled up with her stuffed rabbit. David's pulse pounded in his ears. He ran a trembling hand over his face. The call had been a warning. Right pointing finger, they hadn't taken her. Right pointing finger, but they could. And next time? They wouldn't just be making threats. The boiling point, Carter's fury unleashed. Back at Brooksville PD, David was done playing defense. He slammed the door to his office and called the FBI agents he had been working with. Right pointing finger, I need protection for my family. Now. The agent's voice was calm, controlled. We'll send a unit to watch the house. Right pointing finger, that's not enough. David's voice was steel. Right pointing finger, I don't want to wait until something happens. I want these bastards taken down before they make another move. A pause. Then, the agent spoke. Right pointing finger, we might have something for you. David's grip tightened around the phone. Tell me. The agent hesitated before saying. Right pointing finger, we flipped one of them. David's heart jumped. Right pointing finger, who? Another pause. Then, two words that changed everything. Right pointing finger, Captain Lawson. The unexpected betrayal, when the enemy is closer than you think. David stood frozen, his mind racing. Lawson? The same Captain Greg Lawson who had challenged him in front of the entire department? The same man who had stood by and let Daniels run wild for years? Right pointing finger, are you telling me he turned on his own people? The agent sighed. We offered him a deal. Lesser charges if he helps take down the others. David clenched his jaw. Of course. Lawson wasn't flipping out of guilt. Right pointing finger, he was flipping to save his own skin. And yet. This was the break David needed. If Lawson was talking, then the Brotherhood was finally cracking. The meeting, face to face with a traitor. That night, in a cold, windowless room, David sat across from Greg Lawson. The man looked pale, tired. Sweat lined his forehead. Right pointing finger, you're a disgrace to this uniform, David said coldly. Lawson let out a bitter laugh. Right pointing finger, spare me the morality speech, Carter. I know what I am. David leaned forward. Right pointing finger, then tell me. Tell me everything. Lawson exhaled sharply, then nodded. Right pointing finger, Daniels is planning something big. He's got people in high places, judges, city officials, even a few at the state level. He's not just trying to take you down. Right pointing finger, then what? Lawson's eyes darkened. Right pointing finger, he wants you dead. David's stomach tightened. Right pointing finger, and your family too. Silence. David sat back, heart hammering. This wasn't just about Brooksville anymore. This was about survival. The countdown to war. David makes his move. By dawn, David had already assembled a strike team. Police light, FBI agents. Police light, federal marshals. Police light, the few officers he could still trust. They weren't waiting anymore. They were going after Daniels. This was it. The final battle. The Brotherhood had been exposed. Now? Right pointing finger, it was time to burn it to the ground. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Brooksville, Daniels stood in an abandoned warehouse, surrounded by his loyal men. His phone buzzed. He picked up. A deep voice on the other end of the line said. Right pointing finger, Lawson flipped. Daniels' grip on the phone tightened. His expression darkened. Right pointing finger, then we finish this. Tonight. He hung up and turned to his men. Right pointing finger, get ready. Because when the sun set that night, Brooksville would never be the same again. Not every war is fought in the streets. Some are fought in the shadows. Brooksville was on the edge of something violent. David Carter had spent his entire life fighting battles. He had fought for justice, for truth, for the kind of world his daughter could live in without fear. But this was personal. Because tonight, the war wasn't just about the badge. Right pointing finger, tonight, the war was about survival. The last warning, the Brotherhood's final move. David was back at his office, studying the files on his desk, when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered, expecting another threat. Instead, what he heard made his stomach drop. Right pointing finger, we have your wife. David's blood ran cold. His grip tightened around the phone. Right pointing finger, if you touch her. A chuckle on the other end. Right pointing finger, come alone, Carter. No backup. No FBI. No tricks. David closed his eyes, forcing himself to stay calm. Right pointing finger, where? The voice smiled. You'll know when you get there. Then, a click. The line went dead. David sat frozen, his pulse pounding at his ears. They had Emily. This was it. Daniels and his people weren't just trying to scare him anymore. Right pointing finger, they wanted to end him. And they were using his wife to lure him in. The setup, walking into the fire. An hour later, David drove alone into the abandoned shipping yard on the outskirts of town. The night air was thick with humidity. His fingers tightened around the grip of his gun, but he knew better than to draw first. This wasn't a shootout. This was an execution. He stepped out of his car, scanning the darkness. Then, a single overhead light flickered on. And there she was, Emily. Tied to a chair, blindfolded, her breathing ragged. And behind her? Right pointing finger, Ryan Daniels. Flanked by 5 officers, his last remaining soldiers. David exhaled sharply. Right pointing finger, let her go, Daniels. Daniels smirked. Right pointing finger, you don't get to make demands tonight, Chief. The men around him chuckled. Daniels gestured toward David's gun. Right pointing finger, drop it. David hesitated for half a second, then slowly, deliberately, placed his weapon on the ground. Right pointing finger, now, untie her. Daniels grinned. Right pointing finger, you don't get it, do you? You're not leaving here alive, Carter. David clenched his jaw. He had expected this. But what Daniels hadn't expected. Right pointing finger, David wasn't stupid. And he wasn't alone. The betrayal, who do you trust? In the distance, a single gunshot rang out. One of Daniels' men collapsed. The rest spun around, weapons drawn. Police light, floodlights exploded across the shipping yard. Police light. Police car, FBI agents. Federal marshals. Brooksville PD's Internal Affairs Division. David smiled. Right pointing finger, you think I came alone? Daniels' face twisted with rage. Right pointing finger, You set me up. David took a slow step forward. Right pointing finger, no, Ryan. He tilted his head. You set yourself up? Daniels reached for his gun. Collision, bang. A sniper shot took out his weapon before he could fire. He stumbled back, his hand bleeding. FBI agents stormed in. Daniels' men were taken down one by one. Police car, sirens filled the air. Officers who had once ruled this town with fear? Right pointing finger, now they were the ones on their knees, handcuffed, forced to face the justice they had denied others. The fall of Ryan Daniels, the last stand. As two agents grabbed Daniels, he thrashed violently. Right pointing finger, you think you've won? He roared, his voice cracking with desperation. David stepped forward, standing eye to eye with the man who had terrorized this town for years. Right pointing finger, no, Daniels. He exhaled. I just ended you. Daniels lunged, but the agents dragged him to the ground. He fought. He screamed. But for the first time in his life, he was powerless. David turned away. He had bigger things to worry about. He rushed to Emily, untying her bonds, pulling her into his arms. Right pointing finger, are you okay? Her hands shook. Her breath was ragged. Right pointing finger, I knew you'd come. David closed his eyes, exhaling sharply. Right pointing finger, always. The aftermath, was it really over? By sunrise, Brooksville had changed forever. Police light, over a dozen officers arrested. Police light, city officials taken into federal custody. Police light, the Brotherhood? Officially dismantled. But as David stood in his office, staring out at the city he had sworn to protect, he knew the truth. Corruption never really dies. Right pointing finger, it just waits for its next opportunity. A knock on his door. He turned. FBI agent Sarah Cole. She looked grim. Right pointing finger, we have a problem, Chief. David raised an eyebrow. What kind of problem? She hesitated before sliding a confidential file across his desk. He opened it. And what he saw made his stomach drop. Because Ryan Daniels hadn't been working alone. There was someone else. Someone bigger. And they were still out there. Fire, final thoughts, the war isn't over. David Carter had won the battle. But was the real enemy still in the shadows? Would he survive the next fight? Or had he just walked into something even more dangerous? When you cut off the head of a snake, another one grows. The war for Brooksville PD had been fought. Ryan Daniels and his corrupt officers were in federal custody. The Brotherhood, once untouchable, had crumbled. The town was changing. But David Carter knew better. Because corruption never really dies. And as he stared at the classified file on his desk, he realized the real battle was just beginning. The file, the hidden enemy. David flipped through the pages. Right pointing finger, bank transfers. Right pointing finger, confidential case files that should have been destroyed. Right pointing finger, a list of names, powerful names. At the bottom, a signature stood out. A name David hadn't expected. Collision, Police Commissioner Henry Lancaster. The highest-ranking law enforcement official in the entire state. David's jaw tightened. Right pointing finger, Daniels was never the mastermind. Right pointing finger, he was just another pawn. And now? David had just declared war on the king. The FBI's warning, the next battle begins. Agent Sarah Cole sat across from him, arms folded. Right pointing finger, you got lucky with Daniels. David raised an eyebrow. Lucky? She leaned forward. Right pointing finger, you were dealing with small-time corruption. Crooked cops in a small town. She tapped the file on his desk. Right pointing finger, Lancaster is different. He has friends in places you can't even imagine. David exhaled sharply. He already knew that. Right pointing finger, so what's the FBI's move? Cole hesitated. Right pointing finger, we can't touch him. Not yet. He's too well protected. David scoffed. Of course. The system always protects its own. A choice, walk away or fight back? That night, David sat at his kitchen table. A whiskey glass sat in front of him, untouched. Emily sat across from him, watching him carefully. Right pointing finger, tell me the truth, David. His fingers tightened around the glass. Right pointing finger, it's not over. She nodded slowly. She had known that. Right pointing finger, so what are you going to do? David was quiet for a long time. Then, finally, he spoke. Right pointing finger, I don't know yet. But he did. He just didn't want to say it out loud. Because once he did, there was no turning back. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, Police car, inside a sleek office in downtown Raleigh, North Carolina. Commissioner Henry Lancaster sat behind his mahogany desk. The city skyline stretched behind him. A phone buzzed. He answered. Right pointing finger, is it done? A voice on the other end responded. Right pointing finger, Daniels and the others are out of play. Carter took them down. A pause. Then, Lancaster chuckled. Right pointing finger, interesting. And Carter? What's his next move? The voice hesitated. Right pointing finger, we don't know yet. Lancaster leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. Right pointing finger, find out. A click. The line went dead. Lancaster smirked. Right pointing finger, let's see how far you're willing to go, Chief Carter. Final scene, the war isn't over. The next morning, David walked into his office. A single envelope sat on his desk. No name. No return address. Inside? Collision, a single photograph. His daughter at school. A simple message was written underneath. Right pointing finger, back off. David clenched his jaw, his vision tunneling. He turned to look out the window, fists tight at his sides. Police light, Brooksville PD was safe. Police light, but the fight had just moved to a bigger battlefield. And now? David Carter had to make a choice. Right pointing finger, walk away and let corruption win. Right pointing finger, or take on the most powerful man in the state, alone. His phone rang. He answered. A familiar voice spoke. Right pointing finger, Chief Carter, do you want to take this fight to the next level? David's lips curled into a slow, determined smile. Right pointing finger, let's do it. Ending, a fight that never ends. David Carter had won one war. But the battle for justice? It never really ends. Lessons from the story, fighting corruption in real life. David Carter's battle wasn't just about cleaning up a corrupt police department, it was about standing up when no one else would. His fight reminds us of a hard truth: corruption isn't just a problem in fiction. It's real, and it exists in every level of power. So, what can we learn from his story? Right pointing finger, 1. Speak up, even when it's dangerous. Change doesn't happen when people stay silent. Whether in your workplace, your community, or even in politics, calling out injustice is never easy, but it's necessary. Staying quiet only allows corruption to grow. Right pointing finger, 2. The fight for justice never ends. Just like in the story, taking down one corrupt figure doesn't mean the fight is over. New threats always emerge. Whether it's in law enforcement, business, or government, power will always attract those who abuse it. Staying vigilant is key. Right pointing finger, 3. Protect what matters, but be strategic. Carter didn't rush blindly into battle. He gathered evidence, built alliances, and planned his moves. In real life, fighting corruption or injustice requires smart strategy, not just courage. Right pointing finger, 4. The cost of change is high, but worth it. Change comes at a price. Carter put his life, his career, and his family on the line. Are you willing to do the same for what's right? Final thought. The world doesn't change because of people who accept things as they are. It changes because of those who refuse to back down. Right pointing finger, so, will you be a bystander? Or will you be a fighter? Flexed biceps.